Hello. If you are not attending the conference in person, you will unfortunately not see me, but rather a small number of slides. I hope that the variety of the audio will make up for the sameness of the video. I'd like to say that it's an enormous honour to be asked to deliver the Pioneer Lecture, and it's an honour that I take so seriously that I feel I should apologise to the committee for having far too much to drink and for touching several people inappropriately a little bit later on at the lunch today. My brief was to do something a little left of centre, so I've had 3 ideas for alternatives to a dry recitation of facts and figures. I could recount for you the entire history of nuclear medicine through the medium of interpretive dance. Or I could go with Technetium the Musical. It's a light-hearted romp through the periodic table featuring everybody's favourite isotope. No? The Curie's on ice? Okay, suit yourselves. I've lost count of how many departments I've been in all over the world and how many different scanning procedures I've seen, and I know for a fact that progress is as much about what you leave behind as what you carry forward with you. Today I'll talk about what nuclear medicine was like 40 odd years ago and about procedures that we used to do at one time, but which after assessment were found wanting and were cut off like a toxic relationship. And in much the same way as watching the pond scum of humanity on the Jerry Springer show makes you feel so good about yourself, by the end of this, believe me, we're all going to feel like gods. The Oxford English Dictionary defines progress as to move forward, advance or develop, especially to a better state. So any discussion on progress must include a starting point because you can't know how far you've come if you don't know where you started. For these milestones, I turn to the SNMMI website. I've cherry-picked these entries, but if you go to the SNMMI website, you'll see the same names time and again, the giants of the industry, names that are instantly recognisable, like Anger, Casson, Kuhl and Taplin, to name but a few. You can see that the early work with isotopes was on the therapeutic end of the spectrum and that nuclear medicine coalesced, if you will, from the primordial soup that became radiotherapy. For us, the big step forward was in 1958 when Hal Anger invented the first gamma camera. At last, pictures, not just numbers. And with that, nuclear medicine became an independent modality, not an offshoot of something else. For those of you who have only ever practiced nuclear medicine in a palatial, well-designed, multi-modality department of medical imaging, believe me when I tell you it was not always thus. Particularly in older hospitals, new disciplines like nuclear medicine were an afterthought. Not having been taken into account when the first stone was laid, they had to be accommodated wherever they could fit, and sometimes where they couldn't, most often in basements, outbuildings, or conveniently adjacent to the morgue. I'd like to draw your attention to this particular item. In 1962, David Kuhl developed SPECT, which was then used to develop CT images out of X-rays. Let me reiterate that. SPECT first, not first CT. Now, I know it's not a competition and we're all striving as one for the betterment of the patient, blah, 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 blah. But we won, damn it. Am I the only person who's excited by this? I think not. Oh yeah, baby. To be honest, our early images left a great deal to be desired, and in my attempt to describe them adequately without using the word crap, I consulted Roget's thesaurus. Now, I can tell you that the images were, in alphabetical order, atrocious, deficient, imperfect, inadequate, inferior, lousy, substandard, and unsatisfactory. But hey, you've got to start somewhere. Before I start on the horror stories, I'd like to show you this. Available for sale in the 1950s, it came with samples of radioactive ore so kiddies could practice their skills with a Geiger counter. You can't buy it now. See, we're making progress already. Let's go back in time. I started in nuclear medicine in 1978 at Royal Prince Alfred Hospital, not where the department is located now, but in a building which should, even back then, have been condemned by the health department. It was lovingly referred to as the old pie factory, but despite the name being reminiscent of cosy English tea rooms, it was poky, dimly lit, and totally charmless. Now, I realise when you say it like that, it's always going to sound negative, so I'll just say that on the plus side, we were able to go about our work unhampered by an excess of natural light or air. There were at that time only 12 nuclear medicine departments in Sydney, all of which were in public hospitals. It wasn't until a few years later that the first Sydney private practice opened, and the doctor who was brave enough to step outside the system was roundly condemned as a pariah. It can't have been that morally offensive, though, because before too long, everyone was overcoming their righteous indignation and hopping on the bandwagon. Private practices were springing up left, right and centre, spreading throughout the suburbs with all the alacrity of the Omicron variant. In 1978, we only did planar scans. Yes, my friends, 2D was good enough for us. And what's more, we did them on single-headed gamma cameras. None of those fancy schmancy multi-headed contraptions. Anterior first, then, 10 minutes later, the posterior. Just the way God intended it. All data acquisition was, if you'll pardon my language, analogue. No computers, no redemption of data. Oh, and by the way, no application specialist. I had yet to be invented. We techs had to come up with our own sneaky workarounds when someone else in the department did something stupid. No newfangled automatic collimator changing either. Everything was manual. Collimators were screwed onto the detector housing with wing nuts about 8 centimetres long, which took a minute and a half each to screw in. Every image was captured on a Polaroid, with the camera requiring different intensities for different scans. Invariably throughout the day you'd hear, "Who left this on brain intensity?" We did, I seem to recall, quite a bit of repeat imaging. Each and every single solitary Polaroid had to be labelled by hand with patient name, date, scan, view name, isotope, number of counts, and view duration. On a heavy day, this equated to manually transcribing War and Peace. Don't worry about your fingers cramping, they said. It won't be permanent, they said. Yes, that explains this horrible claw. The Polaroids were stuck to the patient's manila folder and had to be smeared with a sticky sealant, which prevented them from being scratched or fading over time. Because of the slow-drying nature of the sealant, scanning rooms were often to be seen draped in folders full of little black squares, being fanned frantically by technologists in the manner of Egyptian slaves on amphetamines. And if, God help you, you closed a folder before it was completely dry, it remained closed in perpetuity. Such were the extraordinary adhesive properties of this sealant, you'd have a better chance of separating conjoined twins. If that happened before the doctor had reported on it, oops. On the upside, we never had to fill out any of those pesky radiation incident forms back then. In 1978, there was no HMPAO. For brain scans, we injected straight pertechnetate in an effort to see any disruption to the blood-brain barrier. If you were lucky, that might indicate an abnormality. I will remind you that with no SPECT, we only did 4 planars, an ant, a post, and 2 laterals. Couple that with the fact that we weren't actually imaging the brain per se, only the vascular space around it. What chance did we possibly have? We struggled on valiantly, despite the sensitivity and specificity being worse than appalling. The reports were written in what I like to call ambiguese and were peppered with lots of can't be excluded, not inconsistent withs, and could be indicative ofs. But that didn't seem to dampen the enthusiasm of referrers of the day. We did 6 a day, every day, and this is what they looked like. Is it just me, or... In the early 1980s, we started acquiring studies on computer. Not all studies, of course. That'd just be plain ridiculous. Mostly just the cardiacs. The hard drive cabinets, that's what we called them before we had towers, and there were 3 of those, occupied an entire room in much the same way the Nazis occupied Paris. The storage discs were the size of pizzas. Not those little pizzas, the big ones. We loved them because it meant that we no longer had to deal with magnetic tape. Some years later, we moved to the cutting-edge technology of the 8-inch floppy disk. 10 to a box, each in their own stylish paper sleeve. Like teenagers in love for the first time, we revelled in the glow of this new advancement. And when we look back on how happy we'd been with the old pizza discs, my goodness, didn't we feel silly? At the time, there were no fully integrated digital systems in Sydney. Computers were cobbled onto existing gamma cameras, often with a hot glue gun. You know I'm joking, don't you? Hot glue guns hadn't been invented then. The management of this new digital data required a lot of implementation, and we all had to hit the ground running. It was, quite naturally, a time of trial and error. It was a time of blood, sweat and tears, and several other bodily fluids, which, in the interests of propriety, I won't name individually. It was a time that goes some way to explaining why physicists are, well, you know, the way they are. During the 1980s, SPECT imaging became routine. Acquisition was one thing, but reconstruction, oh, what a palaver. Recons had to be set up at the end of each scanning day and run overnight. When we returned the following morning, voila, the recons were there waiting for us, as if by magic. But don't open the champagne just yet. They still had to be filtered and reformatted into trans, sag and coronal slices. By way of comparison, about 10 years ago, Siemens released a technology called XSPECT. This took a 256 matrix SPECT, a 512 matrix CT broken down into 6 tissue classes, all recon separately with up to 48 iterations each. I did a quick tally and found that a 2-volume XSPECT had over 9,000 times more calculations than a filtered back projection in the 1980s, but took only 1/720th of the time. Never mind that this recon was done on a separate tower and didn't impede the acquisition or processing of other data on the primary workstation. Yet when I had to break the news to customers that a recon would take 40 seconds, there was blood in the streets. Hand on my heart, I took more flack than Daniel Andrews did when he announced the 6th lockdown. Some of you looked at me like I'd just drowned your puppy. Now, I had a snappy rejoinder ready, which I couldn't use or I'd lose my job. But now that I answer to no man, what I was going to say was, Doctor, if you think that 40 seconds is a long time, I would like to extend my condolences to your wife. The hybrid scanning that you all take for granted now had a tortured development. The first incarnation was an isotope-based system and was quite clunky compared to the CT-based methods which was to follow. In the interim, we imported a CT of that patient from radiology to use for the purpose of attenuation, correction and fusion. Before hybrid systems were mainstream, this was quite the rigmarole. We attached fiducial markers to known anatomical landmarks, which would show up on both our scan and on the CT. We'd scan the patient, then take them around to radiology, trying in vain not to dislodge the markers in the process. And, Mr. Smith, we're walking, but not moving. When at last the CT was imported to our computers, and that's a story in itself, but I'm on limited time here, we were always hopeful that this time the automatic fusion would work. Slim patient, good scan quality, surely it'll fuse without a hitch. Regrettably, however, every single time, as we all knew it would, it came down to a manual alignment. Even if you were exceptionally proficient with a mouse, you could kiss a half an hour of your life goodbye. But after a lot of mucking around, it looked spot on in 2 axes. The third was always out. It was always to be expected, I suppose, because the tools we had corrected for motion that was translational, not rotational. And hoping that patients would move like little Pac-Man when we had got them off one bed walked them to a different department and got them on another bed was optimism to the point of delusion. Even after the passage of so many years, I still feel moved to say, damn you, sagittals, damn you all to hell. To progress, we need to learn. And one of the ways in which we learn is to make mistakes. And so help me, Mother of God, haven't we made some doozies? In the years before ultrasound was routine, if an obstetrician suspected placenta previa, they used to inject an isotope to localise the placenta. And that isotope? Indium-113M. Picked because it was safe to have in close quarters with a developing embryo? No, 391 keV. Higher than iodine. The sharp decline in the popularity of this scan roughly coincided with someone realising that there's not much by naturally occurring lead shielding between the placenta and the fetus. Probably a good thing that no long-term study was ever undertaken on these babies. But just quietly, I got a 50 that says that all of these babies went on to become either talkback radio hosts, politicians, or someone I used to go out with. Another dead end on the long road of progress was neutron activation analysis, a technology that started out so full of promise, but unfortunately for our purposes failed to deliver. The whole body scanner at Westmead was, to my memory, the only one in any nuclear medicine department in Sydney, which should give you a big clue. That first year, techs at other hospitals would say to me with undisguised envy, "Oh my God, you've got a neutron activation scanner?" And then the year after that, they'd say, "Oh my God, you've got a neutron activation scanner?" I only remember 2 or 3 scans ever having been performed there. However, the news wasn't all bad. The bed was of generous proportions and ultimately proved very useful for the storage of many archive boxes. Other scans that used to be in vogue were a gastroesophageal reflux study in adults, where we used to feed them labelled eggs, wrap their abdomen in the world's largest sphygmomanometer, put them under a camera and image while increasing the pressure until they threw up. Mop and bucket to scanning room 3. Bring a radiation monitor while you're at it. I think we only need to ask 2 questions about that scan. Firstly, why? And secondly, and more importantly, why? Another example of cruel and unusual punishment for both the patient and the technologist, and which I believe has since been outlawed by the Geneva Convention, was a scan for cardiac sarcoidosis. In conjunction with the cardiology department, we undertook a study where we wrapped the patient in an ice blanket for 15 minutes before scanning, and which they lay on all throughout the 10-minute acquisition. Understandably, the patient's massive and uncontrollable shivering caused substantial degradation to the image. Bear in mind, these were doctors who would demand a repeat SPECT if a patient sneezed in one frame, but 10 minutes of and the doctor said, "No, don't worry, that'll be fine, keep going." The acquisition complete, and so to the processing. Here's what I had to work with. The ECG looked like the polygraph they got when they asked the question, "Mr. President, did you have sexual relations with that woman?" The image itself, I felt like a psychoanalyst was trying to catch me out with a cleverly constructed Rorschach ink blot. And can you see a ventricle here? No. What can you see? I can see a bunny with a goiter. Have you ever drawn an ROI on a bunny with a goiter? I spent more time looking for valve planers than George Bush spent looking for weapons of mass destruction. That ROI generated a VT curve which defies description. Unless, of course, any of you have ever seen a relief map of the Himalayas. Now, you put all that data together, and is it any wonder that I got an ejection fraction of 6,428? I believe it was at this point that I lost the will to live. I appealed to the powers that were, at the time, to discontinue that lunacy, citing Newton's little-known 4th law, crap data will give you crap results, but to no avail. You have to ask yourself, don't you, what the world has come to when Anne McClenahan is the voice of reason. While working at Marconi, I had to demonstrate an innovation called stereotactic reporting. It was used to enhance the 3D effect of surface-rendered organs, mostly brains. The brain volume was displayed on a black grid background straight out of the Star Trek holodeck. The accompanying glasses had LED lights which synchronised with the graphics card to black out each lens in succession for a microsecond, which gave the impression of a true 3D brain. It was technology that, if nothing else, had a definite wow factor, and I know that for sure and certain because every doctor that I demoed it to said, "Wow," followed by, "Ooh, it's like it's coming right at me." I see no reason to get bogged down in the exact number of doctors who went with this package. Suffice it to say that he was very happy with it, so much so that he took it to a number of multimodality meetings, as witness here, and continued to use it enthusiastically right up until the day the trial licence expired. Vale stereotactic, we hardly knew you. Now, I'm fully prepared to hear from someone that we still do these, so my disclaimer is that these days we see very few, if any, PYP hotspots, testicular scans, liver-lung scans for subdiaphragmatic collections, heat-damaged red cells, and regional cerebral blood flow using xenon. These procedures have all come and gone since I was a trainee. Mind you, so has the Sony Walkman. Be that as it may, why don't we do them much anymore? Because we've got a better way of doing them now. Will we have an even better way of doing them in the future? Hell yeah, that's the nature of progress. While I was gathering and collating my thoughts for this lecture, it occurred to me that if many of you didn't know about some of the scans I used to do, that I might not know about scans that were discontinued before I started. So I rang some colleagues who had a few more years in the industry than I did, and they weren't easy to find. And oh, what gems I unearthed. Sharon Berkery informs me that I-131 liquid used to be delivered in one vial and individual doses had to be aliquoted out by mouth pipetting. Multiple studies showed conclusively that it was particularly bad time to develop the hiccups. I asked her why they just didn't use a syringe, and she said, first-year trainees do what physicists tell them to. Shame, shame, shame. In the 1970s, the only grouping of O, H and S you were likely to hear were in the sentence, today's episode of Sesame Street has been brought to you by the letters of O, H and S, because clearly there weren't any regulators prohibiting unsafe practices in the workplace. Just when I thought I'd heard the worst of it, I received this trinket from Deb Miller. Fasten your seatbelts, it's going to be a bumpy ride. Easily the best disaster story I've ever heard. She tells me that back then, the protocol of a C14 breath test involved the patient returning to the department the following day with a 24-hour faecal collection. The rationale for the following procedure was because there was no well counter in that department. You might think that you're ready to hear this, but nothing will prepare you for what I'm going to say next. The faecal sample had to be liquidised in a blender. I don't know what it is, doctor, but ever since I've heard that lecture, I can't bring myself to start the Thermomix. The liquidised sample was then placed on filter paper, put in a platinum cage with copper wires to add as electrodes. The whole thing was sealed in a tempered glass chamber. Oxygen was pumped in to add fuel. Alcohol dropped onto the filter paper and a large voltage sent through the wire to give a spark and incinerate the filter paper with the sample. On this particular occasion, Deb's first attempt didn't work, so she added some more accelerant. It's easy to sit there with the benefit of hindsight and speculate that that probably wasn't the wisest course of action. You know it, I know it, Deb knows it. Well, she knows it now. Anyway, that extra little dab of alcohol did the trick. Let's face it, when's it ever been known to fail? Meanwhile, after the blinding flash and the bang, crash, tinkle, Deb reports that while the excreta hadn't hit the fan in the physical sense, nonetheless it had managed to cover a surprisingly large area. So now the hot lab was just that much, little bit hotter and a lot less fragrant. Hi honey, I'm home. How was your day? But wait, there's more. When I related the story to Sharon, she remembered doing the same kind of thing for chromium-51 blood loss studies. Thankfully, their department had a well counter, so contact with the actual sample was minimal. However, the 5 cans, one for each day post-admin of chromium, had to be vigorously shaken to distribute the sample homogeneously within the can. They'd come to an arrangement with the hardware store across the road, whereby for a few minutes they would put the cans in the paint mixer. Let's suppose for a moment that you were the inventor of just such a machine and you wanted to market it to a wider audience based on its ability to multitask. After paint, what would be the next most appropriate substance to put in there? Let me see. Of course, little receptacles of human waste. Let's recap, shall we? Seismically pulverising radioactive poo in cans in a paint mixer in a hardware store with the public coming and going. What could possibly go wrong? Here's a quick multiple choice question. That procedure was the result of A, 6 teenage boys, 14 slabs and a lot of weed, or B, well-considered deliberation between senior scientific officers in a nuclear meds department. Smart money's on A, right? Bow. Wrong answer, but thanks for playing. Delvine, what do our losing contestants take home tonight? After I heard that, well, not immediately after because it was a couple of minutes before I regained consciousness, but the first thing I thought was I have got to get back into stand-up. I mean, what a gift. This story is a tight tin on a silver platter. There's got to be some kind of mistake here. I asked for the duck egg blue. Hello, love. Is this your first time painting? Well, here's some tips. It'll dry one shade darker than what's in the can. And make sure you open the windows. There's nothing worse than the smell of paint lingering. Are you sure you don't want it in a semi-gloss? It's bang on trend right now. Hello, customer helpline. Sorry, sir, you've just finished a paint job and it looks like... What? Cleaning up? Just rinse the brush in Terps. And then in Harpic? No, stop me. This has gone on long enough. What a relief it was when Technogas finally burst onto the scene, relegating xenon to the pages of history as a lung ventilation agent. I'll say one thing for it though, it was the great leveller. It didn't matter if you were scanning a supremely fit athlete or a 50-year-old smoker with COAD. When imaged with xenon, every patient had ratty-looking basal segments. Disposal was a huge headache. Various departments had various solutions. Some stored it in enormous plastic bags for a few half-lives. Some used a vacuum cleaner. Some tried venting it through tall chimneys, the wisdom of which has always eluded me, being as how xenon has an atomic number of 54, substantially heavier than both oxygen and nitrogen, making it less likely to float harmlessly away into the atmosphere and more inclined to plummet like a brick to the rooftops of surrounding buildings and, in all likelihood, unsuspecting pedestrians. Another thing which fell by the wayside is the mobile gamma camera, which at the time was a very useful adjunct to a busy public hospital department. Sadly, it was made obsolete by necessity because that was back in the days when planar scans with no CT would suffice, and we've come to expect a lot more than that now. One thing that I notice hasn't changed much in all these years is the reason we're all here in the first place. The money. The patients. They still have the same raft of reasons for presenting, the same hope for good news, and it must be said, a lot of the same idiosyncrasies. If any of you are considering writing a paper for the next conference and haven't found a topic yet, May I suggest a study into the correlation between presentation for gastric emptying studies and sheer nuttiness? All of them, without exception, don't need a gastric emptying study quite so much as they need a thorough psychiatric evaluation. From the woman who ate a packet of Cheezels for breakfast, lunch and dinner and nothing else since the age of 16, and now in her 30s was being investigated for lethargy and hair loss, someone should have had a word to that referring physician, to a lovely lady who was at a total loss to account for her illness. I can't understand why I'm so sick. I truly nurture my body. It's a temple to purity. So I only allow white clothes on my skin, and I only eat foods that are white. In my career, I've met some absolutely delightful patients, some others who were the spawn of the devil, and some who just made me shake my head in disbelief. The clear winner in that last category was a man who, I'll give him this much, was almost as cool as he thought he was, because he had tattoos on every inch available of skin, and I counted 18 piercings in the usual areas and perhaps one or two in the unusual areas. Who would know? I think safest for that to remain one of life's little mysteries. Now, I contend, Your Honour, that when he had all of that done, it would have hurt like buggery. Well, not exactly like buggery, obviously, but my point is it would have made him wince. Yet when I put the tourniquet on him, he told me confidentially that he didn't really like needles. Do you suppose there's a secret cult somewhere that pray to Our Lady of Perpetual Stupidity? And now a quick word about PET. The first PET-only systems gave us functional images, to be sure, but with no CT, there was no possibility of correction for attenuation, let alone quantifying uptake or prettying up the images by fusing them to an anatomical map. We were at the mercy of randoms and singles. Scatter correction and time of flight were a long time away. Timing resolution wasn't measured in picoseconds or even nanoseconds, but microseconds. Crystals were more than twice the size they are today, and there were a lot fewer of them. When you imagine the horrendous quality of those images, it makes you wonder why we even bothered. When PET first arrived here, we were looking at scan times of between 40 and 60 minutes for a whole body. Now you've barely got time to boil an egg. It was at this very meeting in Brisbane a few years ago that a physicist came to me and said, Anne, I've just seen the future. United has launched a PET system which can do a whole body scan in 3 minutes. I said, fantastic. Now all you need is a department with 20 uptake rooms. As they say in the fringe classics, blimey, have we really reached a point in our evolution where it takes less time to scan a patient than it does to get them on the bed? Vendors, pay particular attention here. The take-home point is that when that happy day arrives, you no longer need to fritter away valuable R&D dollars on frivolous things like smaller crystals and better timing electronics. What you need is a machine that gets a patient on the bed in under 2 minutes. Then watch your scanning numbers go through the roof. Whew. Progress isn't always where you expect to find it. I'd also like to just quickly mention theranostics. You don't need me to tell you what it is, but I bring it up because it has, to a large extent, realigned nuclear medicine. When you think about it, we're now closer to radiotherapy than ever we were. After decades of trying to establish our standing as a truly independent modality, dare I say it, we're very nearly back to the womb whence we came. And truly, that's not a bad thing. When I look back on the fuzzy images that they got out of those clunky machines, I wonder if, in their wildest dreams, people like Anger and Taplin could possibly have envisaged the images of clarity and precision that we produce today. I'm tempted to say no, they couldn't have. But then maybe they did, and the only way to achieve that vision was to evolve by small steps, the way we have done. And then, of course, there's another possibility, that the images that the giants dreamed of in 1958 far surpass what we see today. Surely we couldn't be arrogant enough to think that this is as good as it's only ever going to get. I'd like to refer to the slide of digital storage devices. The reason we got so excited when pizza discs came along is because we didn't know that after that there'd be 8-inch floppies and 3.5-inch floppies, magneto-opticals, USBs, CDs, external hard drives. Now, I don't know when, but at some point in the future, we're going to be able to store 100 bazillion Godzilla bytes on the head of a pin, and you can insert it directly into your ear and download images directly onto your retinas. And then we'll all be saying, what in the name of God was that cloud crap about? I think we've spent enough time looking backwards. In 10 years, there'll be someone else up here giving this lecture. It could be any one of you. And if it is, please give the interpretive dance thing some consideration. I really think it has potential. Now, wouldn't it be a hoot if you get to say the turning point in nuclear medicine was in 2025 or 28 or 31, and we're not even there yet? When I was compiling this slide, I had to keep expanding the axes because all the advancements kept filling up the graph, and I thought, that's not a bad analogy. If you keep looking at your past achievements, you don't leave much room for what's coming. You have to keep expanding your axes. So I'm going to close with Old Faithful. I wish I had a fiver for every time I've seen that graph. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to set him up so we're ready to move ahead. Expand the axes, flip him around. I've just put a couple of little advancements there, but I've left plenty of room for that and that and that. Now, we might not even know in detail what those things are yet, but for damn sure they're on their way. I'm going to leave you with 6 words. Where to from here? Surprise me.